And if you're watching this and thinking, I'm not quite convinced, this guy sounds like a proper nerd, then trust me, you're probably the person who needs it the most. Okay, sorry, that kind of came off a bit aggressive, but you know what I mean. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Life Lemons, where I expand on topics that I bring up in my newsletter. Now this episode and video actually is a very special one, because I have my first ever video sponsor, Shortform. But more about them in just a moment. This video is based on my third ever newsletter article, which I've written maybe like 2 years ago now, which was titled, Why I'm Not Done Reading Self-Help Books. So just to give you guys a bit of context, I was at this point where I had been reading self-help books for maybe a couple of years or so, and people would always ask me, why don't you read novels? Why don't you read fiction? And the truth is that I thought about this for some time, because growing up, I read a little bit, but not that much. Like I would read a book here and there that was given to me by my parents, but I didn't have the habit of reading. I didn't particularly enjoy reading a novel because my attention span for reading books wasn't that great. And besides, my take on reading was that I was reading so much as part of school, as part of university, textbooks, online. I felt like in my spare time, maybe I should be playing sports and learning new skills as opposed to more reading. But what happened was I decided to start a business in medical school, which meant that I kind of hit a bunch of roadblocks, and the only way to really get past them, as per everyone's advice, was to read. And so I started reading books on self-improvement, finance, entrepreneurship, marketing, those sort of stuff, okay? There was no fiction involved, purely non-fiction. And by this point, it was kind of becoming part of my identity to be a reader. But I would always think to myself and have other people ask me, why don't you read this fiction book? If you enjoy reading, like surely you should be reading like these novels. I had a real streak going on when it came to reading. I was reading maybe like 2 books a week via Audible. I eventually bought a Kindle, and so I was a bit slower that way, but I was still reading books on that. I really felt like I was onto something. I was learning, I was growing, and so I didn't really want to give it up. I didn't really want to experiment with trying something else, especially a novel, which made me feel like I wouldn't essentially be growing in the same way as I would be if I continued to read these self-help books. Now, I just want to take a minute to talk about this video sponsor, Shortform. Shortform is an online service that offers some of the highest quality guides of non-fiction books that I found online. I've always been a bit skeptical of services that summarize books because they often take away all of the good stuff, but Shortform doesn't do that. They also acknowledge that they're not trying to be a replacement to books, but an additional supplement to help you get the most out of them. I use Shortform in 3 different ways, including revisiting books I've previously read to help with active recall, checking out books that I'm thinking about reading to make sure they'll be a good investment of my time, and as a reference for when I write about topics for my newsletters. Shortform publishes new guides and articles every week, and they let their subscribers vote on which ones to cover next. And they very kindly offered all of you a free 5-day trial where you can explore all of their book guides to your heart's content. Just click on my unique link, shortform.com/Faisal, which will be in the description below. You'll also get 20% off the annual subscription fee, but remember, you have to click the link in the description. Now, I know a lot of you are going to tell me if you want to read good books, you need to read fiction, and now I completely agree. I feel like, obviously that was 2 years ago, and now is a different time. I've kind of like matured in the way I think about reading, but I still haven't kind of made the leap to reading fiction books. But I want to just kind of shed some light on what I was thinking at the time, kind of explaining what my thoughts were for that sort of reflection that I've written in that newsletter. So the title was Why I'm Not Done Reading Self-Help Books, and I kind of thought of it from the perspective of understanding why my brain was so keen on continuing to read these books and not so keen on trying something new. And so my first point in the article was that self-help books really help you to get to know yourself. I was a bit apprehensive about reading self-help books before I started, but what I found was that these books can present themselves in hundreds of different ways. They can include whatever they want. They can be written in loads of different styles. And so I was really starting to enjoy them. And one of the things I enjoyed most about them was that it really started to help me get to know myself and understand myself, because I'd be reading these books by experts on, say, for example, let's say Atomic Habits, which is written by James Clear, on how to build good habits, how to break bad ones. And this is something that almost everyone, I think, could benefit from. I was in my early 20s at university, and I had plenty of habits that I wanted to break and had plenty of habits that I wanted to begin. And so reading all these tips by an expert made me start to introspect, and I really enjoyed the idea of looking at myself figuring out what essentially was wrong and sort of improving on that. That's the whole basis of self-improvement, right? And I had never really taken it so seriously before I started reading these self-help books. And I know for a lot of people who have their reservations about reading these types of books that it might kind of like come across a bit nerdy. It might come across as if like someone's not really got a life by reading these sort of books. But I was surprised that some of these books felt like I was having a conversation with that smart friend that kind of gives you that good life advice that makes you want to go away and sort of fix yourself up and change something in your life for the better. And so for that period of time, I really enjoyed that whole process of introspection. I really enjoyed that process of figuring out how I could improve and move on with things that I didn't really want to try other books. And so I didn't want to change anything up. You know, they say, if it's not broken, don't fix it. And that's kind of how I felt with my reading habits. The second thing was that I realized how much self-help books made me more moldable. It made me super conscious of the fact that for the years prior to me reading these books, I was sort of like set in my ways. Like everything I would do on a day-to-day basis, like my psyche, how I would think about things was sort of almost set in stone. Things weren't progressing or changing as fast as they should have been. And so I quickly realized that all these sort of like hardwired neural connections in my brain could be opened up by reading these books. These books could make me sort of more open to change, more open to new thoughts, more open to new experiences. And if you're watching this and thinking, I'm not quite convinced, this guy sounds like a proper nerd, then trust me, you're probably the person who needs it the most. Okay, sorry, that kind of came off a bit aggressive, but you know what I mean. All of a sudden, I went from not changing that much over years to changing very rapidly in the space of weeks or months, and I kind of enjoyed it. It was all sort of for the better. And finally, I kept getting the same comments by people who read these fiction books, who read these novels, and they would always say to me something along the lines of, if you want to read a real book, you need to read these stories, you need to read these novels. And I don't know, I was just thinking to myself, like, fair enough, novels have their own cemented place in the sort of field of reading, but the way I thought about it at the time was that this was a journey of my own sort of story, right? Like, if Atomic Habits made me fix up my habits, made me, get rid of my bad ones, then that's improving my own story. If Why We Sleep finally helps me to, get a good night's rest and improve my health, then that's improving my own story. And I know it probably sounds a bit abstract to a lot of people listening to this, but to me it made perfect sense. It felt perfectly clear to me that sometimes the best story is your own. Sure, you could read Harry Potter and sort of fall in love with this sort of dream world that has been conjured up, but what about your own? What are you doing for your own story? And so for me, in that instance, I was sort of working on my own story. I was sort of happy to ignore all those amazing novels just to focus on myself, just to focus on my own story, what I was doing. I wanted to try out new things, fail at different things, explore different avenues, and just see what was out there for me to learn. And I wrote one line in the newsletter which I don't completely still agree with now, and I'll kind of explain it, but let me read out to you. With so much left to discover about my story, I'd be a fool to start exploring someone else's. I don't fully agree with that comment anymore. I know that I made this like 2 years ago, but I don't necessarily think you're a fool for exploring other stories. I think that's something like that I'm more kind of like warming towards. But at the time, it was sort of an exaggeration to kind of say that, look, this is my story. I'm focusing on myself right now, and I'm very comfortable in doing so. I don't necessarily need to read outside of self-help books because, I'm moving. Things are happening in my own space, in my own story, and I'm more than happy to continue it for now. Anyways, that was a quick one, but special shout out to Shortform again for sponsoring this video. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and also subscribe to my weekly newsletter, Life Lemons, to get more. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.